Usually when we think about the concept of a sanctuary, there is this profound, um, almost biological expectation of absolute safety, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it is basically a universal law of human architecture and psychology.
Oh, absolutely. It functions as both a physical fortress and, a psychological anchor for people.
Right, exactly. Like you step through the heavy iron-reinforced wooden doors of an ancient stone church,
Yeah.
and the ambient temperature drops. The chaotic noise of the outside world is instantly muffled, and your brain just automatically signals, okay, we can breathe now. We are safe here.
Yeah, throughout human history, the whole idea of a sanctuary relies entirely on the premise that evil or chaos or danger fundamentally just cannot cross that specific threshold. You see this in, the ancient Greek concept of Asilia, where certain temples offered absolute immunity from harm,
Wow, yeah.
right, all the way to medieval churches offering literal asylum to fugitives. The architecture itself is meant to project this divine immunity.
But then you encounter a scenario where that entire foundational concept is flipped so violently on its head that it induces this, like, cognitive whiplash.
Right.
A situation where those impossibly thick stone walls and heavy oak doors were never actually built to keep the darkness out. They were constructed to keep something catastrophic locked inside.
And the moment you realize that, the feeling of sanctuary evaporates entirely.
It really does. You are left with the sudden, crushing realization that you are standing inside a cage.
It is the ultimate subversion of safety. When the very structure designed to shield you becomes the source of the lethal threat, the psychological terror isn't just doubled, it fractures the mind.
Yeah.
You have nowhere left to retreat to because the safe zone is the epicenter of the danger.
And that brings us to the harrowing reality we are exploring today. So for everyone listening, today we are taking a deep dive into a very unique, highly disturbing collection of sources.
We really are. This isn't a standard historical analysis by any means.
No, not at all. We are actually decoding a translated, handwritten journal recently digitized by folklorists. It was a journal found entirely abandoned at the edge of a desolate, unnamed village.
And we are cross-referencing this primary account with local municipal records, obscure regional folklore archives, and even several modern psychological case studies on sensory deprivation and trauma.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Our mission today is to take, yes, you listening to this right now, step by step through this final terrifying warning left behind by a doomed visitor. We are going to explore a secluded, dilapidated stone church that has stood completely devoid of electricity and entirely devoid of a congregation for 40 long years.
A structure whose most critical feature is a heavy basement door secured not by divine faith, but by 6 heavy physical iron locks.
This locks. And according to the municipal records we reviewed, the only human interaction this place has seen for decades is this deeply terrifying weekly ritual.
Yeah, that part is just wild.
Right. Every single Sunday, a designated local goes into this church purely to check if those 6 locks are still closed. They don't go to pray. They don't light candles.
No, they just go to make sure whatever is down there hasn't breached the door.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we need to walk you through this chronological descent into madness so you can truly understand the insidious, manipulative nature of the entity trapped in the dark.
But I do want to set some expectations here, because this deep dive is going to explore far more than just, the threat of being physically mauled by a monster.
Right, which is scary enough on its own.
Sure, but physical danger is biologically simple. Your brain registers a threat, your adrenaline spikes, and you run. What we are examining in these journal entries is profound, calculated psychological manipulation.
Yeah, it's so much deeper than just a physical threat.
It really is. It is an entity that operates like a parasite, fundamentally breaking the mind of anyone who gets too close long before it even attempts to touch them physically.
Okay, let's unpack this. We need to start by looking at the prologue to this nightmare, the decades leading up to our visitor's arrival. The atmosphere of abandonment described in the journal is, it's thick enough to choke on.
It really paints a bleak picture.
It does. I want you to imagine standing just outside this village. It's an incredibly isolated stone building. The wooden crosses in the cemetery aren't just old. The wood is physically rotting away into the wet earth.
And there is zero electricity anywhere near the building after sunset.
Right. Picture standing in that heavy, oppressive silence after the sun goes down, completely disconnected from the modern world. And then, at exactly 9 p.m. every single night, the church bells ring in the belfry.
Just once.
Once. All by themselves, without a single human hand touching the ropes.
I find the acoustic aspect of that detail completely fascinating. We have to look at this through the lens of psychological conditioning, almost like a Well, a twisted, supernatural Pavlovian response.
Oh, that's an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah, the local archives note that the villagers entirely avoided the church at night. Not because it was an empty, abandoned ruin, but specifically because it wasn't empty.
Right.
That nightly ringing bell serves as an auditory heartbeat. It is a daily, unavoidable, long-distance reminder to the entire village that the space is occupied. By making its presence heard miles away, the entity establishes dominance over the entire environment without ever having to leave the basement.
And it clearly took a toll, because for years, the only person who actually lived on the grounds was the caretaker, Father Gabriel. And the local legends documented in these archives about him are deeply unsettling.
They really are the things the villagers claimed.
Yeah, they claim the basement actually breathed at night. They said you could hear dozens of voices whispering, the sound traveling up through the floorboards and out into the churchyard.
Which is terrifying.
Absolutely. And most people, especially today, would dismiss that stuff as urban legends, right?
Hmm.
Like teenagers trying to scare each other. But the skepticism in the village evaporated the day Father Gabriel completely disappeared.
Which is the pivot point where abstract local lore suddenly solidifies into undeniable trauma.
Exactly. Wait, actually, I shouldn't say exactly, because what happened was actually much worse than a simple disappearance. They didn't just find an empty church, they found him 3 days later.
Right.
And he wasn't dead. Honestly, based on the municipal reports, death might have been a significantly kinder outcome. He is found sitting inside the church, perfectly still in the dark, just staring directly at that basement door.
He refuses to eat. He refuses to sleep.
Yeah, he completely refuses to speak to anyone who tries to help him. But every few hours, he breaks his catatonic silence to whisper one chilling, repetitive sentence. He just keeps saying, "It knows my name now."
Over and over.
Over and over. "It knows my name now."
I want to dive deep into the cultural and psychological mechanics of that specific phrase because the implications are staggering.
Please do, because it's so creepy.
Well, throughout human history, across almost every culture, mythology, and religious tradition, a name is never treated as just a random linguistic label.
All right, it's much more than that.
Exactly. In ancient Egypt, the Ren, or true name, was considered a fundamental part of the soul. If it was destroyed or controlled, you ceased to exist. In Jewish mysticism and European demonology, knowing a spirit's true name gives you absolute command over it.
Oh, wow.
So to give a demonic or ancient presence your true name is to hand over the literal keys to your autonomy.
That makes total sense, but I want to bring it into a modern context so we
Sure.
can really feel the weight of it. To me, it reads almost like a psychological computer virus.
How do you mean?
Well, if a hacker is relentlessly pinging your network firewall, that's scary, sure, but your defenses are still active. You're still the administrator of your system.
Right, you still have control.
Exactly. But the absolute second that malicious code bypasses the firewall and secures your root credentials, which in this case is Father Gabriel's true name, it's game over.
Ah, I see.
The hacker owns your system. They can rewrite your core programming.
Mm-hmm.
Father Gabriel's mental operating system was completely hijacked from the inside.
That analogy holds up to a point, but let me push back slightly on the mechanical framing. A computer virus implies a cold, automated process. What happened to Father Gabriel is deeply intimate.
Okay, fair point.
It is the trauma of total vulnerability. When the entity learns his name, he isn't just frightened, his identity is actively being consumed.
Oh man, that's dark.
He knows he can no longer hide, not physically and not spiritually. The entity has perceived the very core of his being. The shock of that total exposure, the realization that his ultimate sanctuary failed to protect his soul, is what triggered the catatonic state. His brain literally shut down to prevent further psychological interfacing with the creature.
That is deeply bleak. And apparently the village agreed with you, because after they pulled him out, they did the only sensible thing. They sealed the church entirely. No visitors, no prayers, no nothing.
Yeah, for 4 decades, it just sat there rotting into the landscape.
Which, rationally, should have been more than enough to keep literally anyone away from this place. But as we know from the very existence of this journal, youth and curiosity are an incredibly dangerous combination,
Very dangerous.
which leads the doomed author of our source material directly into the church, walking right up to the altar to see if the horrific legends were true.
Which brings us to the phenomenon of morbid curiosity. George Lowenstein, a pioneer in behavioral economics, proposed the information gap theory of curiosity.
Oh, I've heard of this.
Yeah, when humans are presented with a locked door or a mystery, the brain registers a vacuum of information. We naturally abhor an information vacuum. We want to categorize the threat.
So we basically have to know what's behind the door.
Exactly. The drive to resolve that uncertainty can be so intense that it creates a dopamine loop that actively suppresses the amygdala's fear response. We walk toward the danger because the psychological pain of not knowing overrides the biological mandate to survive.
I see where you're going, but I still struggle with this. Let's look at the sensory details the visitor writes down upon stepping inside.
Okay.
The very first thing they note is that the church just smells fundamentally wrong. It's not just stale old air. It's wet stone, heavy dust, and underneath it all, the undeniable, visceral smell of organic rot.
Which is a huge red flag.
Right. Biologically, the smell of rot is a hardwired warning to flee disease. Yet they keep walking. They walk up to the massive altar, pull back this heavy, ornate carpet, and there it is, the basement door.
Exactly where the local folklore promised it would be.
Yeah. And there are the 6 locks. 5 of them are heavily rusted, showing decades of age and neglect.
Right.
But there is a glaring visual anomaly that would send me running for the hills.
The new lock?
The lowest lock is brand new, bright, shining metal. Someone has recently replaced it.
The new lock is a brilliant detail because it communicates a terrifying reality without a single word.
Yeah, it really does.
Think about it. A rusted lock implies a dormant system. It means whatever is down there has been quiet. A brand new lock means there has been a recent violent failure.
Oh, God.
Something down there tested the perimeter, successfully broke a heavy iron lock, and the caretaker had to rush in terrified and replace it. It tells the visitor that the threat is not a piece of history. It is active, it is strong, and it is currently pushing against its cage.
And instead of turning around, the visitor moves the carpet all the way back. They actually crouch down. And this is where the sound design of this haunting perfectly activates, shifting from passive atmosphere to active engagement.
The transition here is crucial.
From underneath the solid floorboards, directly beneath the visitor's feet, there are 3 slow knocks. Knock, 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 and then dead silence.
Pacing is everything here. Those 3 knocks are highly calculated.
How so?
Well, if you trap a wild animal, it thrashes, it pounds frantically. But these knocks are measured intelligent.
Like it knows exactly what it's doing.
Precisely. It implies that the entity is fully aware of the visitor's exact location, and it is calmly, almost politely, announcing itself.
And then the visitor makes the ultimate fatal mistake. They physically reach out and touch the wood of the basement door.
Oh, no.
Yeah. The exact second their skin makes contact with the door, the church bells ring violently. But they aren't ringing outside in the belfry anymore.
The shift in location is staggering.
They ring directly above the visitor, inside the stone church, all at once. An overwhelming, deafening alarm that shakes the dust from the rafters.
By moving the acoustic source of the bells from the exterior belfry into the interior space, the entity is demonstrating extreme environmental control.
It's like it brought the outside in.
Yes. And it's a sensory overload designed to induce immediate spatial disorientation. The brain cannot process the impossible volume and location of the sound, which leaves the victim psychologically stunned.
But the journal reveals that this sensory overload is just a distraction for the real weapon. Because cutting perfectly through that deafening, chaotic noise, a voice whispers from just millimeters below the floorboards.
And the nature of that voice is the real horror.
It is incredibly soft. It is perfectly calm. The voice just says, "Finally." But here is the horrific twist that made my blood run cold when I read the translation.
Yeah, this part is really hard to shake.
The visitor freezes entirely because the voice beneath the floor perfectly mimics their own voice. It is their own vocal cadence speaking to them from the dark.
This is where we shift from traditional horror into deep psychological devastation.
It really is.
If we look at the neuroscience behind auditory mimicry, humans have a profound hardwired connection to their own voice. Through bone conduction and the auditory feedback loop involving Broca's and Wernicke's areas, your voice is the primary audio signature of your ego, yourself.
Okay.
When you hear your own voice, your brain processes it with an inherent, unbreakable trust.
It's like looking into a mirror, expecting to see your reflection, and instead, your reflection winks at you while you're standing perfectly still.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it. It plunges the brain straight into the uncanny valley, but on an auditory level.
Wow, yeah.
When an ancient buried evil uses your exact vocal cords to express a dark, satisfied relief, saying, finally, it creates a massive cognitive fracture. It strips away the victim's identity in an instant.
It's so violating.
The entity is telling the victim, I don't just see you through the wood. I have already bypassed your psychological defenses. I am already inside your mind.
That's terrifying.
Before a single lock is even broken, the creature has demonstrated that the visitor's sense of self is entirely vulnerable to theft. You simply cannot fight an enemy that wears your own voice.
And that profound cognitive dissonance absolutely paralyzes the visitor. The journal describes them being completely frozen in place, kneeling over this door, unable to breathe.
Which is exactly what the entity wants.
Right, which sets the perfect stage for the entity to shift its tactics. It has paralyzed their mind, so now it begins its physical assault on the environment. The haunting moves past the illusion of safety and escalates into aggressive environmental horror.
The entity recognizes the paralysis. The psychological grooming phase has succeeded, so the physical manifestation can now begin without the risk of the prey running away.
The lights inside the church die instantly. The visitor is plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. And in that total absence of light, the sounds change entirely.
We lose the visual, so the audio takes over.
Exactly. It's no longer just a soft whisper or a polite, slow knock. Now the visitor hears heavy iron chains dragging beneath the floor. They hear the visceral, grinding sound of metal violently scraping against stone.
The sheer physical mass being implied here is crucial.
Yeah. And beneath it all, a deep, resonant, impossibly large, non-human breathing. The illusion of the human mimic is gone. The monster is stretching its limbs.
By removing the visual sense entirely, the entity forces the visitor to rely solely on auditory input, which we already established the entity has total control over.
Right. It owns the soundscape now.
When the brain is deprived of sight, the auditory cortex becomes hypersensitive. The sound of heavy chains serves a dual purpose here. First, it emphasizes the immense physical mass of the creature. Second, it implies a long, agonizing history of violent imprisonment.
And then the mimic's voice speaks again, closer to the wood this time. Still wearing the visitor's voice, it says, "They kept me hungry."
Such a chilling line.
Which is chilling enough. But then the entity slams something massive against the basement door from below. It hits with such concussive force that the heavy stone altar above it actually shakes and the wood of the door splinters.
The escalation is incredibly rapid.
And in the dead silence that follows that massive slam, the most unnerving sound yet begins. Dozens of faint whispers start speaking together beneath the floorboards.
But they aren't the monster's voice.
No, they aren't demonic growls. They are human voices. Praying, crying, and begging. Now, when I first read this, my immediate assumption was that these were the souls of past victims, trapped in the dark, begging the visitor to help them escape.
A completely logical assumption to make.
Right.
When you hear a crowd of people trapped in a dark basement with a monster, human empathy dictates that they are screaming for salvation.
But that's not what is happening at all.
No, it's not.
The visitor realizes with absolute horror that these dozens of voices aren't begging to escape. They are weeping and begging to be let in.
And this is where the theological horror comes into sharp focus. Why would human souls pray for their own destruction?
Exactly. It defies all logic.
We have to look at the sociology of cults and charismatic authority. What we are witnessing is the ultimate subversion of prayer. Prayer is traditionally an appeal to a higher benevolent power for grace and protection. But here, the entity has inverted the dynamic entirely. It has subjected these souls to such extreme terror that their minds broke, resulting in a metaphysical form of Stockholm Syndrome.
Wow. Metaphysical Stockholm Syndrome. That perfectly describes it.
Extreme terror has been converted into religious awe. These voices are actively appealing to the darkness. It shows the visitor the terrifying endpoint of encountering this entity. It is not merely death. It is eternal, willing subservience to the horror.
It makes my stomach turn. And right as the visitor is processing that twisted realization, a loud metallic crack echoes in the dark. The brand new lowest lock suddenly snaps open, all by itself.
The physical barrier is finally yielding.
Yeah, and through the new crack in the splintered door, something presses against the wood from the other side. But it isn't a massive claw. It isn't some scaly, monstrous appendage. The journal specifically notes that it is a hand. A warm human hand. The writer describes it as feeling too human.
Again, we see the weaponization of the uncanny valley. It's just so wrong.
A monstrous claw is terrifying, but it is easily categorizable by the brain as an external predator. A warm, human hand pressing through the door of a demon's cage is profoundly disturbing because it blurs the line between the victim and the monster. It suggests the entity is comprised of the people it has consumed.
And the mimicked voice calmly orders from the dark, open the rest. The visitor looks down, and a shadow is smiling through the crack in the door.
But not a normal face.
No, not a complete face at all. The text describes it as just the shape of a face, moving and shifting like liquid darkness. It's so fundamentally wrong that the visitor finally breaks their paralysis and stumbles backward, their heart pounding against their ribs.
The biological flight response finally overrides the cognitive freeze, but unfortunately, the environment is already compromised.
It really is. Because the wood of the door is actually expanding outward now, bowing and breathing as if something impossibly massive is pressing against it.
And then the audio shifts again. Yes, the auditory horror shifts locations. The whispers aren't coming from beneath the floor anymore. They're inside the room.
Which means the entity is projecting its influence past the door.
The empty wooden pews behind the visitor start creaking softly. Row by row. Creak, creak. The sound is unmistakable. It sounds exactly as if an invisible congregation is siling into the pitch-black church and sitting down.
It's setting the stage.
And suddenly, the olfactory environment changes. The smell of organic rot vanishes completely, replaced entirely by the intense, heavy smell of wet earth and burning candles. Another loud crack echoes through the stone room. The second lock breaks. There are 4 left.
The sensory details here are critical to understanding the entity's ultimate goal. How altering the olfactory environment manipulates the limbic system is just fascinating.
How does that work biologically?
The olfactory bulb has a direct neural link to the amygdala and hippocampus, meaning smells trigger memory and emotion faster than any other sense.
Oh, right.
The smell of wet earth signifies the grave, mortality, the claustrophobia of being buried alive. The burning candles represent a formal ritual, a vigil. The entity isn't just trying to scare the visitor, it is fundamentally altering the atmospheric reality of the church to suit its needs.
Let's talk about those needs, because as you noted when reviewing the outline of these events, this isn't just a monster trying to bash down a door. It's performing a highly structured ritual.
Yes, we are witnessing the orchestration of an anti-sermon.
An anti-sermon, that's a great term for it.
The creature is not merely trying to break out of its physical prison, it is actively conducting a twisted mass. By filling the pews with its invisible congregation and changing the scent of the room to match dark vigil, it is forcing the visitor to attend its service.
It's totally commanding the space.
The church was built by humans to worship the divine, and the entity is hijacking the entire architectural and theological infrastructure to demand worship for itself. It is executing a complete spiritual coup.
And the haunting doesn't stop with the physical space. It moves aggressively from the environment directly into the visitor's own biology. Which brings us to the breaking of the third lock and the complete corruption of both the holy and the innocent.
Once the physical space is claimed and the congregation is seated, the mental space is the next logical target.
The bells start ringing again, but this time the visitor realizes with mounting panic that they aren't ringing in the belfry and they aren't ringing in the rafters above. They're ringing strictly inside the visitor's own head.
Which is a whole new level of intrusion.
The journal describes the sound as so loud and so deeply internalized that it causes their vision to literally blur, and the thick stone walls of the church appear to physically bend and warp with every reverberation. I read that and immediately wondered how sound can cause visual hallucinations.
That is a brilliant physiological detail by the writer. It aligns perfectly with the effects of infrasound, specifically frequencies around 19 hertz.
19 hertz.
Yeah, often referred to as the ghost frequency. At this frequency, sound waves are just below the threshold of human hearing, but they are physically felt by the body. More importantly, 19 hertz is the exact resonant frequency of the human eyeball.
Wait, really? The eyeball actually vibrates?
Yes. When subjected to this infrasound, the fluid in the eyes literally vibrates, causing optical illusions, blurred vision, and the perception of stationary objects moving or bending.
That is wild.
Combine that with the massive cortisol flood from profound stress disrupting the temporal lobe, and the barrier between objective reality and internal hallucination completely dissolves.
And as their vision blurs from this vibrational assault, they witness the ultimate desecration of the sanctuary. The stone statues of the saints and holy figures lining the walls begin to move.
A total visual betrayal of safety.
At first, it's just barely noticeable. a shift in posture. But then the heavy stone heads turn slowly, scraping against themselves, and their blank stone eyes track the visitor across the room. One of the statues, a figure of a weeping saint, actually begins to cry, dark, almost black, tears down its stone face.
It's such a heavy image.
It is. But let me push back on my own understanding here. Why would an entity bother animating stone? Is it just for the scare factor?
It is far more calculated than a simple scare. It is the absolute visual confirmation of abandonment.
Abandonment by the divine.
Exactly. Statues in a church are specifically designed to represent eternal, unmoving sentinels of faith. They are the guardians of the sanctuary. When these stone guardians are forced to move, when they're forced to weep black tears, it means they are actively mourning.
They've lost the battle.
They are not fighting the entity, they are submitting to it. It is a psychological tactic designed to sever the visitor's last thread of hope. It tells the victim, even your gods are crying. The holy space has been entirely conquered. No one is coming to save you.
That isolation is crushing. And just when the visitor is completely stripped of hope, the entity shifts tactics again. It moves away from grand theological horror and pivots to sharp, intimate, emotional manipulation.
This next part is incredibly insidious.
Over the internalized bells, the visitor hears heavy footsteps slowly climbing the wooden stairs directly beneath the basement door. Step, step. The footsteps stop right at the top. And then a terrified child's voice whispers through the cracked wood.
Please let me out.
This is the trap of innocence. It is a wildly cruel escalation that targets a completely different part of the human brain.
It is. Because despite everything, the mind-bending bells, the weeping statues, the rotting wooden pokes, the journal notes that the visitor feels a sudden surge of protective human compassion.
Of course they do.
They write that they actually took a step toward the door. They almost reached out because the voice sounded so genuinely terrified, so small and human.
And there we see the weaponization of empathy.
It's just evil. The entity understands that pure, unadulterated terror might keep the visitor frozen in place, but compassion might actually compel them to act.
Like they feel obligated to save the child.
Exactly. In evolutionary biology, there are species known as brood parasites, like the cuckoo bird, that lay their eggs in the nests of other birds. They exploit the hardwired nurturing instincts of the host species to ensure their own survival.
Oh, I've seen nature documentaries on that. It's unsettling.
The entity is doing the exact same thing on a psychological level. By perfectly mimicking a vulnerable child in distress, the creature is trying to bait the visitor into voluntarily bypassing the remaining locks. It wants the visitor to be an active participant in their own doom. If terror doesn't force the door open, pity just might.
But the illusion is short-lived. As the visitor hesitates, their hand hovering in the dark, that innocent child's voice slowly morphs. The pitch drops, the cadence shifts, and it turns into a deep, ancient, sinister laugh.
The trap was sprung, and the entity knows it doesn't even need the visitor's help anymore.
The moment the entity laughs, every single light bulb in the entire church, which had been dead for 40 years, explodes simultaneously, raining shards of glass down onto the stone floor. And amidst the shattering glass, a loud, violent snap echoes in the dark. The third lock breaks. Only 3 left.
The explosive destruction of the lights is the final, violent removal of the modern rational world.
It's like rejecting humanity entirely.
Electricity is our primary tool of environmental control. By shattering the bulbs, the entity plunges the space definitively back into the Dark Ages. It is declaring that the environment is now entirely its domain.
The physical barriers are practically gone at this point. The lowest 3 locks are shattered, the heavy wood is yielding. But as you read the final pages of this journal, you realize the true horror isn't the broken locks.
No, it's not the locks at all.
The true nightmare is what the flash of the exploding lights reveals in the darkness. The visitor is no longer alone.
The unseen congregation is finally made visible.
Yes. In the shadows, the invisible worshippers that have been creaking the wooden pews are finally revealed. The visitor looks out over the aisles and sees dozens of motionless people sitting perfectly still in the pews.
The imagery here is so stark.
Their heads are bowed, their hands are folded tightly together in prayer. They aren't moving, they aren't even breathing. And then in perfect, horrific unison, every single head turns to face the altar, to face the visitor.
That synchronicity is what makes the imagery so deeply terrifying. It represents a hive mind, the complete and utter loss of human individuality.
And their eyes, well, the visitor describes their eyes as completely uniformly black, absolute voids in their faces. And altogether, without a single one of them actually opening their mouths, their collective voices whispered directly into the visitor's mind. Open it.
The congregation is functioning as an extension of the entity's will.
They aren't individuals anymore.
Not at all. The visitor is now completely surrounded by the physical evidence of the creature's power. These aren't demons. These are the people who came before, the people who were curious, the locals who pulled back the carpet over the last century.
And under the weight of that collective stare, the basement door finally begins to open. Just a crack. But what spills out of the basement isn't just an absence of light. The journal writer struggles to describe it, eventually calling it darkness itself.
A tangible darkness.
Yeah, it acts like a physical, heavy substance. It moves unnaturally, crawling slowly across the church floor like a liquid, moving completely against gravity up the steps of the altar. And wherever this thick darkness touches, the ancient wood of the church instantly rots and turns to ash.
It is entropy made manifest. The rapid physical decay of the environment perfectly reflects the spiritual decay the entity brings to its victims.
And as this creeping darkness crawls closer to the visitor, the black-eyed worshippers in the pews react. They start smiling. But it's not a normal human smile.
It never is.
The smiles stretch wider and wider, physically pushing past the anatomical limits of the human face, until the quiet of the church is broken by the sickening sound of dozens of jaws physically cracking and dislocating.
The cracking jaws represent the physical toll of this corrupted worship.
It's so visceral.
The entity fundamentally does not care about the physical well-being of its followers. Their bodies are just meat puppets, vessels to express its grotesque joy at being freed. It is a terrifying mockery of human emotion.
And right as this happens, the voice beneath the church speaks again. It's calm, patient, and it finally reveals its true motive. It whispers, "They prayed to stay alive. Now they pray for me."
That line is the critical thesis statement of the entire haunting.
It puts everything into perspective.
This is why we have to view this creature not as a beast, but as a parasite of faith. It feeds entirely on human devotion. These victims originally came to the church seeking salvation, desperately praying to survive whatever darkness they faced in their daily lives.
And it intercepted those prayers.
Yes, it consumed their desperation, corrupted their souls, and converted their raw survival instinct into eternal, horrific worship. It doesn't just want to kill, it demands to be a god.
And a god needs a new prophet. The ice-cold darkness finally reaches the visitor's feet. The journal says it feels like thousands of tiny, freezing hands touching their skin, pulling them downward.
The point of no return.
And in that moment of absolute freezing terror, the visitor's mind flashes back to the very beginning of the folklore. They suddenly remember the tragic, catatonic state of Father Gabriel. They remember his endless, looping warning. "It knows my name now."
The connection is made too late.
Exactly. And right on cue, the entity rising from the basement speaks perfectly. Out of the dark, it says the visitor's actual true name.
The final breach of the firewall. The root credentials have been spoken aloud. The visitor's autonomy is officially and permanently terminated.
The very millisecond the name is spoken, the final 3 rusted locks burst open simultaneously. The heavy iron shatters. The massive basement door creaks violently inward, and from the profound darkness below, the entity finally stands up.
The climax of the journal.
The writer's final entry is frantic. They describe it as impossibly tall, too massive to even fit beneath the vaulted church ceiling. Its outline is twisting unnaturally, and its body is filled with the dozens of whispering voices of its past victims.
A culmination of everyone it has consumed.
Yes. As it rises, the entire congregation of black-eyed worshippers in the pews bow their heads in absolute, bone-cracking submission. The creature looks directly down at the kneeling visitor, and it smiles, using the visitor's exact face.
It is the ultimate violation of the self. If we look at the folklore of the doppelganger, seeing your own face on a malicious entity is an omen of immediate ego death.
It's the end of everything you are.
The entity hasn't just escaped its physical prison. It has wholly stolen the visitor's entire identity. The face, the voice, the name, everything that fundamentally makes the visitor human has been violently appropriated to serve as the new flesh mask for this ancient evil.
It's just staggering. It doesn't just kill you, it replaces you. It walks out into the world wearing your life like a perfectly tailored suit, while you are presumably dragged down into the dark basement to join the chorus of weeping whispers.
It is a fate significantly worse than biological death.
Yeah, without a doubt.
Death is a cessation. This is an eternal, conscious subjugation to a parasite.
So as we step back from the claustrophobic horror of this journal, what is the core takeaway we're left with? The entity locked behind those 6 heavy iron locks was never simply an animal seeking an exit.
It wasn't just trying to break out and run into the woods.
No, it was systematically cultivating an audience over decades. It didn't want escape. It wanted followers. It wanted to subvert the very nature of faith and build its own dark congregation, pulling in one curious victim at a time.
And we must remember that this narrative, these digitized journal pages we've been analyzing, were constructed as a final, desperate warning.
Right, they left the book behind on purpose.
Exactly. The writer managed to leave the book behind before they were completely consumed. That means this is a warning directed specifically at you, the listener.
A warning not to go looking for trouble.
It serves as a stark historical reminder that human curiosity, when uncoupled from caution, especially when dealing with the vast, unknown dark, can lead to total consumption. Some doors, as the municipal archives and the journal explicitly state, are locked for a reason. Ignoring the rust, ignoring the smell of rot, ignoring the warnings of those who came before you is an open invitation to lose yourself entirely.
It's a heavy warning to carry, but a necessary one. And as we wrap up this deep dive into these archives, I want to leave you with one final, deeply unsettling thought to mull over tonight.
It's a question that really lingers.
We know what happened to the entity. It successfully unlocked its cage. It flawlessly stole the visitor's face, their vocal cadence, and their true name to walk freely out into the modern world. But if an ancient, twisted evil is out there right now, living your life, going to your job, talking to your friends with your exact voice, what happens to the you that gets left behind in the dark, screaming beneath the floorboards? Until next time, respect the locks you find in the world.